Yeah, okay. So actually, I just want to start off, well, first of all, my name's Amanda. If you haven't seen me before, in any of our workshops, I usually will introduce whoever is speaking, but today I will be the speaker. So I just want to start off today's workshop with kind of a bit of a roundtable. If you have questions throughout, by all means, like unmute yourself, throw out your question. You don't have to wait until the end. But just to get everybody kind of like thinking about crisis communications, whether you've experienced it as part of your business or maybe a place that you've worked at before, or even just personally, you don't have to share any details, but just kind of what words come to mind when you think of crisis. I'll put it on the whiteboard over here if anybody wants to throw out an answer.
Okay, the economy could be a crisis in some ways.
The economy, yeah.
I think lately the word of the day is tariffs.
Tariffs, yes. For me, I think of like chaos.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what words you were looking for. My first word was panic.
Panic, yeah.
And we're talking what kind of crisis, and because I'm in medical device space, so like regulatory.
Right, yeah, regulatory.
My top concern.
Regulatory changes can be.
For sure. Anyone else online want to throw in anything?
Someone on Zoom is saying risk management or risk mitigation and pivot.
That's good.
That's from Paula Watts.
Thank you. Those are good ones. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so as we go through this, you'll probably see a lot of these words come up. That's
Paula does have words. Paula said reactive and responsive.
reactive and responsive, yes.
Or versus responsive.
Yeah. I'll put that as like a versus. Reactive versus responsive. Yeah. Good. Awesome. Okay. So as you've kind of mentioned through our little word bubble, crisis can kind of come from anywhere. So it can be from your company's direct involvement, but it can also be something outside of your control. So we have regulatory up there, tariffs. Those are things that are kind of outside of your control. So tariffs, trade wars, economic uncertainty, those are things that your company might not necessarily have done. You could do everything right and still be affected. So crisis is basically a disruptive event, situation, or public initiative that threatens a company's ability to operate its business effectively. And as I said, there are different types of crises. They come from different areas. They can be, natural disasters, infrastructure failure. So if you have an actual physical building and something goes wrong, it can be operational. Your technology, if you're developing a technology or you're technology based, you could have a cybersecurity attack, data breach, ransomware. We can have reputational, so a team member misconduct. We're in a very volatile political climate. Somebody could say something that just, irks someone the wrong way. And in the age of social media, that can snowball out of control. It can be environmental, as we mentioned. It can be a supplier issue. So something happens in your supply chain. Again, not necessarily something that you've done directly, but now it's your problem. We have regulatory up on our board there. So legal and regulatory or ethical situations, non-compliance with those contractual obligations. And again, that can be intentional or not intentional, or financial risks. And that, kind of ties in with some of the other types of crises. So why should we have a plan in place? So somebody mentioned risk mitigation. That's one of the main reasons. It's really important when a crisis hits that you have a plan ready to go, because minutes do matter. The speed with which you can respond can mean the difference between a minor crisis and a major crisis. So I have a little chart later on where we'll kind of like walk through that. But especially on social media, where if you take a long time, where there's a lot of silence, that can lead to speculation and it can snowball from your audience. And your narrative can be changed several times before you even put something out there. So depending on your crisis, your team also might be scrambling around trying to make multiple important decisions simultaneously. So we have on our board here, chaos, panic. In moments like that, if you have a plan in place, there's less things to be scrambling about. And then again, you want your communication to be out there as quickly as possible to build trust with your stakeholders. It also improves your employee morale. So if you can communicate very quickly to your employees what the expectations are in this crisis, then you're building up that trust, and that's a really key part of it. So some of you may have heard like the phrase, people won't remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. It's similar in a crisis situation. They'll remember how you responded to a crisis long after the details of that crisis have gone from their memory. So how do we plan? So before a crisis even happens, a risk assessment is a really important activity to go through. So I was just saying to Janice before we started, we've had 2 previous workshops. So Share Powers from OCI did a project management workshop for us and a risk assessment workshop. Both of those have been recorded. They're up on our QPI YouTube channel. So she goes through how to kind of go through the risk assessment process. That's a really good place to start. So in that risk assessment, you can determine what might happen and the likelihood of that happening, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But being able to identify those areas can go a long way of determining a communications plan for that in the future. And as Cher mentioned in her workshop, consulting with your shareholders, your boards, any advisors that you have of potential risks or blind spots that you might not be aware of. Again, watching the news. So we've been talking about tariffs. Being aware that those things could be on the horizon can be kind of a little red flag that something might be coming up, and you can start preparing for that. You can ask your clients for feedback. So if you have a lot of customers and you're seeing kind of some complaints come in, that should be kind of a little clue on your radar that we should be starting some communications around that. And I always say, like, your communications plan can be a living document. So you can treat that like a health and safety plan. So you can have an actual physical document, and I'll be showing you some things that you can put in that document. And the living document should be updated at a regular interval. So depending on your company, you can update it quarterly, twice a year, or with your annual report. And you'll see kind of the items that you can update as we go through this. Okay, so as I mentioned, your risk assessment. So this is kind of just an example. I'll fill in the other 2 spots that are on that table as we go through this, but identifying the risk, the type, so that's the occupational, environmental, financial, type, and then the likelihood of it happening. And then you also want to have a chart showing roles, and this is really important for determining who's going to handle what and when that's going to happen. So again, we don't want to end up in those like panic chaos situations where we're like, who's going to talk to the media? So you should have a spokesperson. If you are a small company, you may be filling multiples of these roles. If you're a larger company, you may have one person for each of these roles. So you'll have a spokesperson that is the person that is front facing, that is speaking to the media. Someone who's your information gatherer / investigator, that's the person who's going to determine like what happened, what was the cause. You may have a communications person, so that communications person is the person that's writing the actual material and feeding that up. So they may be working in conjunction with your investigator or your information gatherer, putting that into some concise, clear language for the spokesperson to then relay that out to whoever needs to get that information. Again, legal, so if you have regulatory issues, anything that may end up in a court later on, you'll want to have a legal advisor or a legal person on board that you can call up quickly and say, hey, this is the communications. Is there anything that we need to be adjusting in here? What should we be telling people? And if you are in like kind of like a legal situation, you may not be able to give all the information that you want to, so they can advise on what you can and cannot say in your communications. Your board members may have a say in what's going on there. Yeah, sorry. And then again, financial. So if you have a financial crisis, you may have financial advisors. You may have an accountant or CFO that needs to have a say in that. And again, that would go to your communications person. They would write it up, and then your spokesperson would bring that out. And again, yeah, IT team, same idea. If you've got a data breach, they may be working with the investigator to find out the cause. That may also tie into legal. So if you've got a data breach, you may have to work with the authorities to determine what's going on there and putting that out. So all of these pieces can work together. We've got we can go to the next slide here. This is just kind of like an example of what that might look like in your plan. So you've got your CEO. Your CEO is your spokesperson. They would handle media relations. They would also make final approval of the outgoing messaging. And then you may also have like the president. Your president might be your lead investigator and working with some of the other teams. But if these roles are kind of laid out in advance, if a crisis happens, you can just pull open your document, say who's doing what. And this kind of allows the rest of your team to continue working while the kind of crisis management team or your crisis communications team does their work. The other thing that this shows, actually, I'll get into it later when we're talking about who's going to get the communications. So our audiences. Determining who needs to know what information and when. So you want to create a hierarchy. If a crisis happens, who's going to be notified first? So as I mentioned before, building the trust of your board of directors and your employees. You also don't want 5 different people going out saying 5 different slightly different things to the media. So like in a big kind of crisis situation, you might have media reaching out to your CEO, and if that's your spokesperson and they are not getting out their messaging quickly, the media might kind of try to get around that and go on LinkedIn, find your employees and say, hey, we heard this is going on. Can you give us some information? If your employees have a directive immediately off the bat to say, if you receive requests for information, please direct them to our spokesperson. So Making sure that everybody that's involved, even if they're not directly involved, even if they're not on your crisis team, if they have a directive, go to the spokesperson for communications. That's a really important part of the process. And then determining your external audiences, and how soon in that chain that they need to get the information. Okay. And then so going back to that chart where we've got our risk, our type, likelihood of it happening. Now we can add in communication method. How are we going to get the information to them? And then the hierarchy of who's going to get the information first. So in that first example, if all of your systems are locked in a ransomware attack, meaning like you can't connect to your business emails, you can't connect to the systems or platforms that you're using, how are you going to communicate to your stakeholders? Are you going to use your personal email? Will you use social media accounts? Will you be putting out a press release to the media? So rather than scrambling around last minute, trying to figure out, how are we going to get this messaging out? If you have those channels identified in advance, then you just need to refer to your document. Any questions about that so far? No? Straightforward? Okay. So again, you can keep in your living document, your media contacts. So you would want to update this if, CTV doesn't exist one day. Then you would just go in and you would update this, but having the contacts, so if you need to send out a press release, then you have all your media contacts ready to go in that document. So you're not scrambling around trying to find the different websites and who you should be contacting in the future. You've got it there in your document ready to go. Okay. And then what can you prepare in advance in terms of messaging? So the goal of your document is to manage your communications to your key audience and to be able to respond in a unified professional manner. So having boilerplates ready. So if you've already gone through like branding exercises, so through our program, if you've participated in Discover Excel, Grindspace Excel, Queen Startup Runway, at any point, you've probably gone through an exercise where you've developed your about, you've probably done some sort of business model canvas where you identified your, done a SWOT analysis, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So you have an idea of kind of risks that might be there, but you also have your mission, vision, values of your company. So you can have those ready to go in your document. And then because you've done your SWOT analysis or your risk assessment, you can do like a bit of a walkthrough of what it might look like if that risk did actually happen. So if you've identified some risks that are high likelihood or moderate likelihood of happening, go through that. You can also check your industry history to see if something similar has happened and what their response was. I wouldn't suggest using like AI to draft any sort of key messaging, but you can ask it to critique. So, you could say, go to like ChatGPT or Copilot or something. I'm in whatever industry. This sort of crisis has happened. What have other companies done? What are the, pros and cons, or what did they do really well? What did they not do really well? And I'll go through a bit more about like key messaging and what should be included. So there's a lot of C words here, but basically how and when the message is disseminated is your control. You want to have clear and concise messaging. Hello.
So sorry.
Oh,
I sent
no
an
worries.
email.
Oh, no worries. Come on in. So, when we're navigating through any sort of crisis situation, We want to have our messaging be clear and concise. You want to be in control of the narrative, basically. So if you can get your messaging out there first, and especially with social media, you want to have even just like a basic statement out there. We are aware that there's a problem happening. We're investigating. We will let you know more information as it comes available, is better than staying silent and just letting kind of the social media machine churn and develop narratives that may or may not be true. And then competence is basically, it's not enough to just do a good job. You also have to appear like you're doing a good job. So being open and honest and transparent builds trust with your stakeholders. You could have a crisis and deal with it, kind of try to sweep it under the rug, pretend it didn't happen. But if it gets discovered later on, you're in for much more work than if you had just been open and said, hey, like this has occurred. This is what we did to deal with it. And we're moving on from it. And then caring and concern. So being empathetic towards those affected by the crisis. So, you know, we understand that this is affecting our customers, our clients, being apologetic. There is a notorious incident of the BP CEO several years ago, probably about a decade ago. There was an oil spill, and in the media he mentioned like, oh, he was so tired of it, he just wanted his life back. And like, okay, we get that, but also everybody else that's affected by the oil spill would also like their life back. So that wasn't very empathetic, and people still remember that to this day, that that was the way that he reacted to the situation. So even when it feels like the situation is very triggering, remaining calm, caring, understanding of whoever it's being affected goes a long way. Having that reassurance that you're committed to striving towards your company's mission, vision, values. So you want your communications to be aligned with that. So if you value providing quality medical care through whatever device that you have, your response should reiterate that, like, we're committed to finding the best possible solution. Just reiterating that will go a long way in restoring people's trust. And then again, all of these things play a role in the credibility. So the quicker your response is, the more professional and empathetic it is, will lend credibility to your company. So going back to that slide where it said people will remember how you respond to a crisis more than the details of the crisis. This is kind of the formula that you want going forward. Okay, so what do we do during a crisis? So how quickly do we need to respond? So this chart here shows kind of the level. So minimally intense, your crisis may not even be happening. Maybe you're just monitoring the situation. So if we think about like the tariffs, we knew in January, there were inklings, there were rumors, we're monitoring the situation. That's minimally intense. Moderately intense means the crisis is now happening. You know, tariffs are now in place. We've got slow and steady attention that's kind of gaining some momentum there. Your employees are aware of the issue. Media is starting to request information. You should have something kind of like ready to go at this point. And then, you know, intense is you've got multiple sources of media reaching out to you. They may actually, at this point, depending on what the crisis is, be reaching out. If you've got a spokesperson, media might be reaching out to different parties within your organization. If you have a large enough team, looking for different angles of your crisis. And then, you know, you may see, if you've got social media pages, a marked increase. So a lot of new impressions coming in, a lot of new comments. And then your highly intense is when people are expressing outward anger and outrage about the situation. This is when kind of it feels like if you have social media, it might feel out of control. It's difficult to control the narrative because you might have a spokesperson saying, you know, this is the incident, and you've got all of these other kind of narratives going on. In a crisis situation, again, depending on the crisis, you can go from minimally intense to highly intense within a matter of hours. So if we have time at the end, I do have like a little case study, but I was mentioning to Janice just before we started that one of the things that inspired me to kind of put forward this presentation is that back in October, there was a group that pitched on Dragon's Den. There was an incident where they said something on the show that came off as insensitive. Their product seemed like they were appropriating a culture that they did not belong to. The show aired, and within hours of the show airing, they had a full-blown crisis on their hands. And it took them 3 days to respond to that. So in that time, there was a lot of social media outrage. There was a lot of different narratives going on. People were being threatened. And so if you don't have that kind of like response ready, or you haven't planned your, you haven't done your like SWOT analysis where you've got your strengths and your weaknesses, those opportunities and threats kind of identified, then something like that can just like feel like it's coming out of the blue. Okay, so when you're in a crisis, you need to stick to the plan. So we've identified our roles and responsibilities. Stick to that. Again, we don't want 5 slightly different messaging pieces coming from 5 different people. We want one person disseminating the information, and, you know, information is being fed up to just one spokesperson. The crisis team should be focusing on the event, as I said, so others can continue to do their work. Remain calm, resist an aggressive approach. It can feel very triggering when you have a lot of people asking questions to you. Try to resist being dismissive, downplaying. You don't want to downplay it. People are there. They want to understand. They want answers. So as much as you can, as long as you're not legally required not to, give them the answers that they're looking for. Being honest and transparent builds trust with your, as I said, with your employees, with your customers, with your shareholders, anybody who does kind of business dealings with you. Building that trust is the most important thing. So you want to keep it simple. So you don't want to be putting fancy jargon out there. You may use fancy jargon in your industry, but in crisis communications, you want to stick to very clear and concise facts. If you absolutely must use specific terminology, define it for your audiences in your communications, and be empathetic. So I'll give you another example. This is probably about a decade ago. Sometimes timelines in my mind. I think of like 2020 as like just yesterday, but probably about a decade ago, Lululemon, a big company, they make athleisure, had an issue with their product that was their pants were see-through. People were complaining online that their pants were see-through. They, instead of just, you know, recalling the pants, replacing it, their communications could have just been like, yes, we understand there's a problem. We are replacing them. We appreciate our customers for bringing this to our attention. And we're committed to providing quality athleisure. The spokesperson that they had, their CEO, was dismissive of the situation. Didn't think that the see-through pants were that big of a deal. I think she said in a media interview that, well, you'd have to like really bend over to see that they were see-through, but like they're yoga pants. People are really bending over in these pants. The founder, Chip Wilson, also made a comment that maybe it's not the pants that are a problem, it's the people that are wearing them, indicating like there was some definite like body shaming going on there. So responding in that manner made their crisis situation go from what could have been minimally intense, maybe intense, to full-blown like high intense. People were outraged based on the communications that they put out. So if you're open and honest, and as I said in that slide that has all the C words on it, you follow that, you stick to your plan, don't go off script, as the higher ups at Lululemon did, then you can prevent a crisis from going from something that could be kind of a minor issue. I mean, the company lost a lot of money because they had to recall those pants and do better, but they lost even more money because now they had to replace those pants, and now they had to also do a full rebranding, get rid of their CEO, ask their founder to step off the board. It became like a much bigger issue. So empathy goes a long way. Remaining calm, not being dismissive, can prevent your crisis from going from something that is relatively easily fixable to full-blown disaster. And then, so this is a feedback loop. How often you communicate, again, depends on the crisis that you have, but it's a process. So it's not just like a one and done situation. The loops that you go through may be long or short timeframes, depending on the situation. So this could be multiple times per day. It could be multiple times per week, per month. So it might start as, very quick succession loops and then draw out as the situation resolves or as conclusions are determined. So we're starting with this top one here, verify facts and assess the situation. And then if you've already gone through your crisis communications plan, you have your boilerplates ready to go, you have something kind of prepared, then you can then just tweak that a little bit based on the facts, get that messaging out. So then you're notifying, going back to your hierarchy list of who gets notified of what, when. So notify the parties that need to be. Then you can continue investigating. So in a situation like a data breach, Ticketmaster has had several data breaches. So in a situation like that, you could say, we understand that this has happened. We're investigating. We will update you as we have more information. And then maybe a couple of hours later, based on investigations, X number of customers have been affected. We continue to work with authorities to rectify the situation or to continue investigations. We'll continue to update as we go. And then educate is, once we've found out more information, continuing to feed out that information to the public or to whoever needs to be notified. This is what happened on this date. Here's our timeline. And then you're monitoring your situation. So do we need to continue investigations? Are we now in a legal situation? Has the situation resolved? And depending on where you are in that monitor situation, then you may have to start that loop again. Okay, so then what comes next? So following a crisis, then you can take time to analyze the situation with your team. So part of it is crisis management. How did this happen? And then evaluating how did we do? So could we have increased our communication frequency? Was anybody confused by the messaging that was being put out? Did it feel chaotic and panicked? Were we prepared enough with the communication boilerplates that we had? Was anybody left out that should have been included in our communications plan? And again, you go back to that living document that you have, updating that as you need to. What could have prevented, or how do we prevent it in the future? That again would be part of your like crisis management, but it could be, you know, in the case of Lululemon, how do we prevent someone from going off script? You know, did we pick the best spokesperson on our team? In that case, probably not. And then, you know, how do we move forward with our brand, with our company? You know, do we need to go through another exercise where we're revisiting our company's mission, vision, values, and making sure that our communications are more in line with those values? Okay. Awesome. Okay, that is the end of this. We can go through the case study, or I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any. So I don't know if anybody actually saw this when it was on Dragon's Den. This happened in October of last year. In this boba tea pitch that happened, the entrepreneurs came on and they pitched this. If anybody's ever heard of boba tea, it's sometimes iced tea, sometimes it's like a milk tea, can be fruit-based, can be milk-based, it has like either fruit at the bottom or what they call bubbles, little tapioca balls at the bottom. It was originally developed in Taiwan, so it is an Asian developed tea. And then on Dragon's Den, the people who were pitching were white people from Quebec that were essentially saying that they've taken this Asian derived tea and they've made it better. They made statements that, you know, they weren't sure of the ingredients, and now they're making this healthier version of a drink. And one of the Dragon's Den judges, Simu Liu, made mention that on the bottle, the packaging that they had, it didn't acknowledge that the drink was of a Taiwanese origin, and the response from the company was very dismissive. They also made a statement on the show during their pitch that the product is not an ethnical product anymore, like they're kind of making it better. And so people were rightly very outraged about that, based on their response to it. So the episode aired on October 10th, and immediately gained traction online. So it immediately went from kind of like I guess monitoring the situation, no crisis, to high intensity crisis. Like people were outraged that they were essentially appropriating the culture of someone else and trying to make it into like a product sold by white people without acknowledging that it was not just kind of like a random product. Like this was a product that was developed in Taiwan. It became very popular in Asian markets before it even made it to North America. And as a result of the outrage online, this boba tea company created an apology, but it was 3 days later, and by that time the clips had gone viral on social media. It was on TikTok. People were stitching the episode. The company owners were receiving threats. The investor who said that they would invest in the company was also receiving threats. They actually ended up pulling out of the investment, and they had a deal with Costco, and Costco actually pulled out of the contract as well. So I'm just going to put up, just for us to see, the actual statement that they put out, just so that we can kind of go through it together. I'll read it to you because it's kind of long. It says, we fully understand the backlash over our feature on Dragon's Den based on what people saw on TV. When we said you're never quite sure about its contents, we were not referring to the traditional bubble tea formula found in specialized shops, nor were we criticizing it. We can appreciate that this wasn't communicated effectively in the episode, as English is our second language. What we were comparing it to is the other ready-to-drink products like ours found in big box stores. On the show, we were presenting our newest boba formula, which hasn't been released everywhere yet. In this version, we removed all artificial coloring, flavoring, preservatives, while maintaining a lower sugar content. This is what we were referring to when we mentioned a healthier option on the show. Regarding the cultural significance and origins of bubble tea, we know our choice of words was misguided and understand people's reactions. What we were trying to do is celebrate that many other cultures are now enjoying this wonderful drink. Our choice of words was wrong when trying to explain our point, and for that we are extremely sorry. We never claimed that boba is new. What we explained during the show is that we have produced a different way to package it with a ready-to-drink glass bottle that minimizes environmental impact. Our Taiwanese partners were heavily involved in the research and development of this product, which we believe helped us achieve such early success. At no point did we mean to insinuate that our boba bubble tea is better than traditional bubble tea in any way. Does anybody have any thoughts on this response? Or anything that you think might be missing?
I guess it was like a lot of, we're sorry, but you guys just didn't, like, it was just misrepresented, which I guess to some extent as a TV show I sort of get, but like when people are emotional reading this, it'll feel a lot like a non-apology, possibly.
Right, yeah, and that's the way a lot of the public felt about it after the fact. So because they didn't make a statement right away and they had kind of like snowballed online, when they came out with this apology, it still felt like they were making excuses instead of just saying like,
You were wrong.
yeah, we were wrong. There's also no kind of commitment going forward that they are going to change any of their packaging to acknowledge. So while they're saying, you know, we're trying to celebrate other cultures, there's no kind of acknowledgement like, hey, we're changing our packaging. We're working with people, you know, a company from Taiwan, that's our supplier. We're changing our packaging to appreciate the culture that it came from. They also don't have like on any of their boards anybody of Asian descent, so it still comes across very much like white people trying to appropriate a product that is not meant for them to do so. Anything else? Any other?
Is that not infringement?
It wouldn't, I don't think it would be infringement. It is cultural appropriation for sure. But there's no sort of like copyright. So in looking into this, in Taiwan, there's two different kind of tea shops that are claiming the origin of bubble tea.
So would it
There's
be
no actual
trademarked,
like,
or-
there's no actual trademark either. So
Okay.
they've been in a legal battle of who can claim the origin of this tea. I don't think it's been resolved, so we can't really go back to something like that. I see, Paula, you've got your hand.
Oh, no,
Oh,
no,
okay.
I'm just, no, that's just me. No, I mean, when I look at this, what I'm thinking is right off the bat, it's like, you know, where they talk about, you know, English is our second language. So right off the bat, it's like, this is why, what you're saying, like there isn't a validation. Whereas for me, it would be like right from the beginning, recognizing and validating people's concerns. One of the things as well, and I don't know if this is necessarily crisis management, but more with regards to research and development and market research is even prior to this to really fully understand, you know, the origins of bubble tea. You know, and crafting something based on that. Like you need to know your target demographic. You need to know sort of where your product would stand within the market. And that's, you know, that for me was their biggest mistake more than that, which is fully understanding the market, having, you know, someone with that experience to assist them in the branding and the explanation, knowing that they were going online and within that context. I kind of just read it that they were, I don't know, just a little bit more of a narrow mind about when they went on the show. And it was kind
Mhm.
of like their response is exactly the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, I had a very similar reaction, Paula. So, as I mentioned before, like we've had through Queens, Discover Excel, Grind Space Excel, we've had Startup Runway, we've got the We Can project. We're always having workshops like this so that people are aware of like what's out there. And so when I saw the pitch and I've seen companies going through their pitch practice and getting feedback, my initial reaction was at no point when they were developing this product did someone point out to them that this product might be appropriating someone else's culture.
Mhm.
Like when they did the initial risk assessment, did they not come across that? And if they did they just dismiss it? So that's like one of those, we go back to like one of the beginning slides when we're doing the risk assessment and you're reaching out to people, ask them if you have any blind spots so that you're preventing kind of a situation like this, right? And that's what advisors are for, and that's what doing those assessments are for in advance, so that you don't end up in a preventable crisis, right?
Mhm.
So you ideally you want to be doing things right with your business so that if you run into a crisis, it's probably something that is like beyond your control. Yeah.
I think in their situation too, that very surprising that they had no response for 3 whole days after airing, because these kind of show they must have filmed it way
Yeah.
before it was aired. And so
Yeah.
even if no one on their board realized a problem,
Mhm.
Simu Liu said there was a problem, made a big scene on the show. Like
Yeah.
they should have known at that point that it will look bad on them once
Yeah.
this airs. So like the fact that they still had no response, they had that whole time between production to release, from release uh, to like 3 days after, and during that whole entire time they did not prepare an answer, suggests
Mhm.
that even at the time when a potential customer, potential stakeholder is stating a very real concern, they still decided to ignore ignore this, which I think looks especially bad on
Yeah.
Just want to kind of, when a company is doing a risk assessment, and I've done lots of risk assessments, I think one of the things that they don't truly believe is that something will go wrong.
Mhm.
And so they spend time, they look for the obvious stuff and don't concentrate on other factors. And we use terms like known unknowns.
Mhm.
So you have things that you know could happen, you
Mhm.
can describe them. The other end of that spectrum is the unknown unknowns,
Mhm.
and they're the ones that should keep you awake at night because you don't know what they are
Mhm.
until they happen to you.
Right.
And this is where it's important to talk to your advisors, talk to your board, talk to other people, because they may have been through something like this.
Mhm.
And, you want to lessen that pool of unknown unknowns and move them over into the known unknowns column.
Mhm.
And I think when you do that, you can really mitigate your risk a whole lot better.
Right.
And, in this example, stupidity shouldn't have been an unknown unknown.
Right, yes, yeah,
Yeah.
we are in 2025, this aired in 2024. Even in 2024, I would hope that people have gone through some kind of DEI awareness. To know that this was like very blatantly, like this is not just like a subtle thing. And as Janice mentioned, it was filmed, they must have known exactly at that point. I think if that was me doing the pitch, I think I probably would have left there with a sinking feeling in my stomach, preparing immediately after for some kind of statement. Yeah. But yeah, that, yeah. Yeah, so again, in a situation like that, minutes do matter. So even if you can put out a very basic statement, we acknowledge that there was an issue. Give the facts. You don't have to make, so in this statement, they made a lot of excuses. You don't need to necessarily make excuses because that can come back to bite you a little bit. People get defensive about that, but you can just state the facts. Here's the situation, here are the facts about the situation. These are the values of our company, and here's what we're trying to do to be better. So that's kind of the outline. Thanks, Paula. Have a good day.
Bye, Paula.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome.